So our second round is 5-minute moments of rebuttal. So it's quite obvious the way this is going to play out. Mr. Hitchens for 5 minutes, Mr. Brummett for 5 minutes, and then once again. So Mr. Hitchens, I go to you for 5 minutes, sir.
All right. If you notice, the examples I adduced of religions often hostile attitude to culture or to what makes it possible, which is independent thought, free inquiry and freedom of expression, is not a matter of extremists. All the examples I adduced were from the mainstream practice of the religious establishment of civilized Europe for many, many centuries. I don't believe I instanced any hedge priests or Savonarola types or anything of this sort. These were statements or positions, policies that had the force of something more than moral law for millions of people and were enforceable. I sometimes grow tired of those who seek to say, yes, well, there are extremists and fundamentalists and there are things, terrible things are done and said in the name of religion, or sometimes in the name of God. It's not in the name of. It's not a hijacking of. It's in the text. Professor Brummett, I'm sure, won't disagree. If we take his chosen field in his opening statement of eschatology, the study of the end of days, it's easy enough to attribute things like that to some crackpot cleric and false calculator and obviously bad astronomer and mathematician in the United States, who, in common with William Miller and all the others before him and the Jehovah's Witnesses, think they can actually assign a date to it. You'll notice they also do it with tremendous relish. It's not saying this will be a terrible thing. They can't wait for it to happen. Actually, insofar as it involves having them raptured off the planet and snatched up into the sky, I personally wish it would happen too. I can't wait for them all to go. But though there were many people at the time who argued that perhaps the book of Revelation shouldn't make it into the final cut of the Bible, and actually Martin Luther had grave reservations to the end of his life as to whether that was really the revelation of the Word of God or not, the book of Revelation is there, canonically present, and it's there to be referred to as an authority by religious people at any time they may choose. Who, if I was to give you the following statement and then ask you who made it, I wonder what would happen. Here's the statement. Who made it and when? I'm sorry, I should add. A nuclear holocaust, said this person, would have no terrors for us. It would be no more than the wholesale ushering of our species into a better future to which it is, in any case, destined to go. Now, who would like to take a shot at guessing who said that? You would perhaps want to say it was the Ayatollah Khomeini on a particularly grumpy day. And then indeed there are people, not just extremists by the way, but members of important governments who have made statements of that kind, very recently in Pakistan, saying actually the end of days, if it took that form, would be a welcome thing. God would know his own. The proper survivors would survive it. For the rest of us, it would just be too bad. But the statement I opened by quoting was made by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1960. In a very important intervention, I think in a debate in the British House of Lords. So I rather tend to bristle when people say, oh, well, you can't just pick on the extremists and fundamentalists. First, I don't do that. Second, it may not be denied that the positions they take have scriptural and textual warrant to them. Talk to the most liberal or supposedly liberal Muslim you can find. The one who hopes for coexistence, who says I'm a moderate Muslim and all the rest of it. Can you get him in public to say that the Hadith, which have equal standing as religious authority with the Quran in Muslim belief, do not contain the injunction, unqualified, unsoftened injunction, that apostasy, the abandonment of the Muslim faith, or the adoption by a Muslim of another faith, even worse, isn't punishable by death? You can't get them to say it. Because if they were to admit it, they'd have to say that something in the Hadith was not just morally wrong, but wrong. Well, lots of luck trying. The problem is in the text to begin with. Now, in my book, God is Not Great, I credit religion with, among other things, giving us our first experience of literature and textual authority, and indeed textual criticism in the Bible. It was our first attempt at taking the written word seriously. Well, I was going to add that it was also our first attempt at astronomy, cosmology, healthcare, and a number of other things. But I'll have to compress that and simply say that just because it's first doesn't necessarily make it original or authentic. The first try is very often the worst try. And in this case, I think that that principle would apply also.
Thank you. Dr. Brummett?
Yes, Mr. Hitchens' hope that the rapture would clear some of the rascals out reminds me of the statement that Mark Twain made, which he said, when I think of some of the disagreeable people who've died and gone to heaven, I am moved to lead a different life. Mr. Hitchens began early in his most recent statement, I think, with a very interesting point. If I understood him correctly, he's arguing that he's not talking about extremists because he's talking about grand institutions, and that was not his terminology, but I think that's what he meant. He said he's talking about governments, he's talking about established churches, he's talking about established religions, and therefore, I think was the point that he was making, that's not extremism. I don't take extremism to mean the same thing as an outsider. I think it is certainly possible for an institution to be extremist in the sense that I laid out at the start of my remarks, which is asserting there are sure and certain systems for matters which really ought to be talked out instead. So I think that may be a difference between us, and perhaps that's worth exploring. But also in his first statement, when he listed a number of the complaints that he had in mind, he talks about feudalism, he talks about the monarchy, he talks about the 30 Years' War, he talks about St. Peter and the papacy and so forth. Of course, these are not outsiders, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are not extremists. In fact, I would argue that in many of these cases, what you have is a case of people who are already in an empowered position. And what they essentially are doing is they are trying to find religious trappings so as to keep that power going, so as to perpetuate that power. I think people are Italian people are, or I should say were, in his examples, they were Italian aristocrats and Northern European warmongers first, and they decided that Christianity would be a good way to justify their rapaciousness. And I would punctuate that a little bit differently than he did. He also says that the people that he complains of, and again, I'm annoyed by the same people, I think, that they do have scriptural basis for what they're doing. Sure they do, but that doesn't mean they're not extremist in the sense that I laid out that definition as I would propose it. You can take the scriptural basis for almost any religion and you can justify almost any code of conduct from it. The question is, do you justify it by extremist means, by saying that this provides us with a sure and certain system for belief, or do you say here is a text that we need to wrestle with? Because the Bible says both, that you should take your swords and beat them into plowshares, and it also says you should take your plowshares and beat them back into swords. And you can quote either one depending on your mood and the political and social purposes that you want to serve. I think it's important to recognize that ambiguity, to get back to one of my solutions that I proposed. I think it's important to recognize that ambiguity in religious texts, and I quite agree that many people do not. And those are the people of whom I think both of us would complain, those who take those religious texts as if they offered a sure and certain system. Now let me just say that doesn't mean that one is necessarily an extremist if one believes in God or Allah or you name it. I think there's a difference between thinking that there must be some sort of higher power, there must be some sort of spiritual dimension to life. There's a difference between thinking that and thinking that I have a sure and certain system that can get at knowledge of that, rather than thinking that this is something that we need to talk about, this is something we need to hash out, this is something that we need to work out among ourselves as people, because after all, we're not saints, we're not God, we don't have direct access, although, of course, many people do. So I think that, or think they do. So I think that those are some important differences between us, just in terms of what we have said so far. 4 seconds?
No, you've got a good 24 seconds.
Good, 24. That's okay. I'll pass it on to Mr. Hitchens.
All right.
Good. Professor Brummett again correctly says that anyone can look at any religious text and take any prompting or authority from it that they like for any number of sides of any proposition. That again seems to me to be true to the point of obviousness, but to show something that I assert at the very beginning, which is the religion is man-made, and that it shows. God did not make man. A single creator did not make us. Our species, mankind, instead made and continues to make many hundreds and thousands of gods, again in the hope, the vain hope, of certainty, and in some cases in the hope of being able to establish a secular tyranny of rule by men over men, but to say that these men have divine warrant for what they do, which has led, as you know, to the stifling and near destruction of civilization. Now, if you don't believe that there is a creator, if you don't believe that God made me, if you don't believe the first proposition is the correct one, I don't see in what sense at all you are religious. And so I again resent the idea or the imputation of extremism. It is the essence of religion to say that there is a creator and that we may not know his mind entirely, we may interpret his wishes, and that these can be conveyed by a priesthood to other humans. That's the mainstream belief, that's the essential core of the thing. If you don't believe it, and I don't, then in a very non-extreme way, you've ceased to be a religious person. But I say, man made gods and not the other way around. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. Well, in the interests of fairness, Professor Brummett, do you wish to call back time and take 30 seconds to...
Well, just 5 seconds. I fear I may have been unclear or be misunderstood. I'm not at all accusing Mr. Hitchens of extremism. I'm saying the people who he is annoyed by, I think, are extremist. I think he's...
No, but that's just what I wasn't saying. That's just what I wasn't saying.
That's why it's turning into a debate. That's good.
All right.
Yeah. You did, Professor, you did not call me an extremist. I wouldn't particularly have bristled if you had, but you carefully refrained from doing so. What you did, which made me bristle even more, was to say that the examples of religiosity that I adduce are extremist beliefs. Now, they're not. All the ones I've offered you are the mainstream essential ABC of religion, the first of which is that in the beginning God created the cosmos. To the contrary, I say, the gods that we've made are exactly the gods you'd expect to be made by a species that's about half a chromosome away from being chimpanzee.
Okay.
Glad to clear that up.